The heavy oak door clicked shut, a sound that shouldn't have been audible over the holiday din, yet it rang through me like a gavel strike. Rejection has a specific frequency, I realized. It cuts through the scent of expensive Merlot and fresh pine, sharp and undeniable. Around me, the restaurant was a blurred wall of sound, clinking crystal, laughter, the aggressive cheer of families reunited. I sat frozen at table 4, my hands gripping the linen napkin in my lap. I was the quiet one, the intense one, and now the woman sitting alone at a table for 2 on Christmas Eve. A waiter paused, pity in his eyes, but he didn't approach. The wine bar, The Vintage, was designed for lovers. It was all velvet shadows, amber lighting, and the kind of hushed, sultry atmosphere that usually made me feel safe. Tonight, though, the low light felt like an interrogation room where my solitude was the only crime being investigated. The chair across from me was still warm. That was the worst part. It wasn't empty because of a traffic jam or a family emergency. It was empty because 20 minutes ago, Sarah had checked her watch, offered a tight, polite smile, and told me the truth. "You're just very quiet, Lucy. It's a little intense. I don't think there's a spark here." The words echoed in the space she left behind. Intense. Quiet. The twin sentences I'd served since childhood. In the library, amidst the stacks where I spent my days, those traits were assets. Silence was a currency there. Intensity was how you found the right reference for a desperate student. But here, in the world of casual dating and holiday mixers, I was a heavy book in a room full of magazines. People wanted easy reading. They wanted banter and light flirtation, not someone who listened so hard it made them uncomfortable. I took a sip of water, my throat feeling like it was lined with sandpaper. The humiliation wasn't a mental state. It was a physical heat crawling up my neck, staining my skin. I could feel the eyes of the couple at the next table, a quick, darting glance before they whispered to each other. They were dissecting the scene. Poor girl, dumped on Christmas. I smoothed the skirt of my dress. It was a dark green velvet, stiff and formal, chosen specifically to make me feel armored, elegant. Now it just felt like a costume for a play I didn't know the lines to. The bar prided itself on patience, on things that took time to mature. The irony wasn't lost on me. I was 32, and apparently I hadn't matured into anything palatable yet. I looked at the glass of red wine Sarah had ordered and left untouched. A bold Cabernet, she'd said. She took one sip and decided it was too heavy. Just like me, I traced the rim of my own water glass. My fingers were cold. The contrast between my freezing hands and my burning face was disorienting. I felt exposed, peeled open. In the library, I was the guardian of other people's stories. I knew where everything belonged. I could categorize chaos into the Dewey Decimal System. Here, there was no system. Just the raw, messy collision of expectations and reality. The couple next to me laughed again, a sound that grated against my nerves like a bow drawn too hard across a violin string. I imagined what they saw. A woman in a green dress, sitting straight-backed and rigid, staring at an empty chair as if she could will someone into existence. It was pathetic. That was the word that kept circling in my mind. Pathetic. I tried to summon the anger I knew I should feel. Sarah had been rude. She hadn't even finished her drink. She'd cut her losses with the efficiency of a day trader dumping bad stock. But anger required energy I didn't have. All I had was this heavy, hollow ache. The feeling of being a puzzle piece from the wrong box. I took a breath, holding it in, trying to stabilize the tremor in my hands. I would count to 10, then I would leave. 1. The scent of cinnamon and clove from the mulled wine special drifted over. 2. The door opened again, letting in a blast of winter air that cut through the warmth. 3. I adjusted my posture, shoulders back, chin up. If I was going to walk out of here alone, I would do it with some semblance of dignity. 4. The shadow arrived on 5. It wasn't a passing shadow. It anchored itself at the edge of my table. It blocked the view of the happy couple, the festive lights, the judgment of the room. It was a reprieve, a sudden eclipse. I didn't look up immediately. I looked at the shoes first. Polished black leather, sharp, immaculate. Not the scuffed sneakers of a busboy, not the comfortable loafers of a patron. These were shoes that meant business. The air shifted, the temperature dropping just a fraction, or maybe the heat in my face finally cooled. The clinking of the bar seemed to dim, pushed back by the sheer gravity of whoever was standing there. I looked up, past the empty chair, past my own humiliation. The woman standing over me didn't look like she belonged to the festive chaos of the main floor. She looked like she had been cut from the shadows in the corners of the room. She wore a charcoal suit, tailored so sharply it seemed to hold her in a state of permanent, elegant tension. There was no festive red, no softening jewelry, just the crisp white of her collar and the glint of a silver pin on her lapel, a small, stylized bunch of grapes. A sommelier. She held a bottle of wine by the neck, her grip loose but possessive, like it was either a peace offering or a weapon, and she hadn't decided which one she'd need yet. She wasn't looking at the empty chair. She was looking at me. Her gaze was dark, direct, and completely devoid of the pity I had seen in the waiter's eyes. Pity is soft. It tries to cushion the blow. This woman's expression was hard, an assessment that stripped away the noise of the room. "You look," she said, her voice dropping into the space between us like a heavy stone. "Like someone who appreciates complex structures, not easy blends." It wasn't a question. It was a statement of fact, delivered with the confidence of someone who reads people the way I read call numbers. Before I could respond, before I could stammer out an excuse or ask for the check, she moved. She didn't ask if the seat was taken. She simply pulled out the chair Sarah had vacated, the chair that still held the ghost of my rejection, and sat down. The shift in power was immediate. The humiliation that had been radiating off me was suddenly contained, absorbed by her presence. She set the bottle on the table with a solid thud. The label was dark, illegible in the amber light, but the glass was thick, old. She reached for the empty glass Sarah had left behind, inspected it for a microsecond with a curl of her lip, and set it aside. She produced a fresh glass from somewhere, I hadn't even seen her holding it, and began to pour. The liquid was dark, almost black in this light, moving with a viscosity that suggested weight. The scent hit me before she even finished pouring. It wasn't the fruity, jammy smell of the house Merlot. It was heavy with cedar, tobacco, and something sharper, like black pepper or wood smoke. It smelled like a library after a fire, ancient and intense. "I didn't order that," I said, my voice sounding thin to my own ears. "No," she replied, sliding the glass toward me. "You didn't. You ordered water and let a woman who drinks sugar water dictate your worth." She leaned back, crossing her legs, her eyes never leaving my face. That woman leaving? It wasn't a tragedy, darling. It was a mercy. I bristled, the librarian in me offended by the unsolicited volume of her opinion. She rejected me. It's not exactly a mercy to be left alone on Christmas Eve. "It's pruning," she countered, the words slicing through the air. "In the vineyard, you cut back the weak growth. You sever the branches that just suck up energy without producing fruit. You do it so the vine can concentrate its power. She wasn't strong enough for the soil you're growing in. She would have choked you out with her mediocrity." My hand hovered near the stem of the glass. The metaphor was arrogant, but it hooked something deep in my chest. Pruning, not abandonment, refinement. She leaned forward then, her elbows on the table, closing the distance until I could smell her perfume. Sandalwood and rain, clean and cool against the heat of the room. Her eyes were dark, unflinching. They didn't scan the room for better options. They were locked on me, reading the tension in my jaw, the white-knuckled grip I had on the table edge. "You're holding yourself together so tightly. I can hear your bones creaking," she murmured. The noise of the restaurant, the clinking glasses, the laughter, faded into a dull roar, background static to the frequency she was broadcasting. "You think you're too much, too intense, too quiet." She reached out, her hand hovering near mine, but not touching. The heat of her skin radiated across the inch of space. "But the best vintages are always the most difficult to open," she said, her voice dropping to a whisper that vibrated in my spine. They require patience. They require air. They require someone who knows how to handle the pressure without breaking the cork. She paused, and the silence between us stretched, heavy and electric. "So," she asked, her gaze dropping to my lips before snapping back to my eyes, "are you ready to be undone?" The question hung there, terrifying and seductive. Undone. It implied ruin, but it also implied release. The knot in my chest, the one I'd tied tight to keep the intensity in, loosened just a fraction. A coiled heat started in my stomach, different from the shame of earlier. This was anticipation. I didn't answer verbally. I couldn't. I just stared at her, my breath catching. She took my silence as the answer it was. She stood up abruptly, the movement fluid and sharp. She didn't look back at the table. She just tilted her head toward the back of the room, toward the shadows where the staff entrance lay. "Bring the glass," she commanded softly. I followed her. It was an instinct, not a decision. The noise of the restaurant fell away as we slipped through a heavy velvet curtain and down a narrow flight of stone stairs. The air grew cooler with every step, the scent of perfume and roasted meats replaced by the damp, grounding smell of earth, oak, and thyme. It was a smell I knew, a cousin to the scent of old paper and binding glue that filled my library. But where books smelled of dry preservation, this place smelled of living fermentation. The cellar was a cavern of shadows and organized silence. Floor-to-ceiling racks stretched into the gloom, holding thousands of bottles in their dark sleep. The only light came from low sconces that cast long, amber shapes against the stone walls. It felt secret, subterranean, a place where the rules of the surface world, the polite rejections, the forced holiday cheer, didn't apply. Vivian moved to a heavy wooden table in the center of the room. She didn't turn on more lights. She didn't need to. She set the bottle down and turned to me, her silhouette cut sharp against the dim racks. "Sit," she said, nodding to a high stool. I sat. My heart was hammering a frantic rhythm against my ribs, a stark contrast to the stillness around us. I placed the glass she'd told me to bring on the wood. My hand was shaking. Just a little. But she saw it. "Nervous?" she asked, her voice low, bouncing softly off the stone. "I don't usually follow strangers into basements," I managed, the librarian in me trying to assert some logical order on the situation. "I'm not a stranger," she corrected, stepping around the table until she was standing right beside me. "I'm the one who saved you from a bad pairing." She reached for the bottle, but instead of pouring immediately, she held it up to the light. "This vintage," she began, her tone shifting into something professional yet deeply intimate, "is widely misunderstood. People open it too young. They taste the tannins, the bitterness, the hardness, and they think it's unapproachable. They think it's closed off." She poured a small amount into my glass. The sound of the liquid hitting the crystal was the only sound in the room. "But it's not closed," she murmured, setting the bottle down. "It's guarded. It built walls to protect what's at the center. It demands you wait. It demands you pay attention." She looked at me then, and I knew we weren't talking about grapes. I felt a flush rise from my chest to my neck, hot and exposing. She was reading me aloud, translating my personality into the language of her world. "Pick it up," she instructed. I reached for the stem. "No," she said. Her hand shot out, covering mine. Her skin was cool, her fingers strong. She didn't pull away. Instead, she adjusted my grip, sliding my fingers down to the base. "Don't choke it. Hold it lightly. Let it breathe." The contact was electric. It wasn't a spark. It was a current, a steady, humming charge that ran from her fingertips into my wrist. I stopped breathing. The distance between us had collapsed. She was close enough that I could count the eyelashes framing her dark eyes. She smelled of the wine now, and that clean, sharp sandalwood. "Swirl it," she commanded softly. I obeyed, my hand moving under the guidance of hers. The wine coated the glass, dark tears running down the sides. "Now smell it. Don't be polite. Put your nose in the glass. I leaned in, inhaling sharply. The aroma was overwhelming. Dark cherries, leather, smoke, and something floral, like dried violets. It was complex. It was intense. "What do you smell?" she asked, her voice right at my ear. "It's heavy," I whispered. "But there's something sweet underneath, buried deep." "Exactly," she said, and the approval in her voice hit me harder than the wine could. Most people never wait long enough to find the sweet. They leave at the first sign of resistance. She pulled her hand away slowly, the loss of contact leaving my skin feeling cold. She walked around to the other side of the table, creating a physical distance that felt like a challenge. "You're afraid," she stated, watching me over the rim of her own glass. "I'm not," I lied. "You are. You're afraid of being too much. You've spent your life turning down your own volume so you don't disturb the patrons." She took a slow sip, her eyes never leaving mine. "I'm telling you to turn it up." "I don't know how," I admitted, the truth slipping out before I could check it. "I like control. I like knowing where things belong. This," I gestured vaguely to the cellar, to her, to the air between us that felt thick enough to cut. "I don't have a classification for this." Vivian smiled. It wasn't a nice smile. It was a knowing one. A smile that promised trouble. "Good," she said. "Classification is for dead things. You are very much alive, Lucy." She set her glass down. The tasting was over. The lesson had just begun. "Go home," she said, the dismissal sudden but not unkind. "Drink the wine. Think about the walls you've built." She walked me to the back exit, the cold winter air waiting on the other side of the steel door. Before I stepped out, she leaned in one last time, her hand brushing the velvet of my sleeve. "I know where to find you," she said. "The library on 4th. I've seen you there." "You have?" "I appreciate quiet places," she said. "I'll see you soon. And Lucy?" I turned back, the snow already swirling around my ankles. "Don't settle for sugar water." 3 days later, the library felt less like a workplace and more like a fortress I was actively reinforcing. The silence here was different from the silence in the wine cellar. In the cellar, the silence was heavy, waiting for something to happen. Here, the silence was dusty and settled. It smelled of degrading paper, binding glue, and the faint, sweet scent of vanilla that rises from old books. It was a controlled environment. I knew exactly where every volume belonged. I knew that if I walked down aisle 4 of the biography section, the floorboard would creak. I knew that the afternoon light would hit the poetry shelves at exactly 2:15. I was safe here. I was the curator of other people's chaos, keeping it neatly organized on steel shelves. But safety, I was learning, is fragile. It broke at 2:30 on a Tuesday. I was in the back stacks, the section housing oversized art folios that rarely saw the light of day. It was the deepest part of the library, a narrow canyon of books where the air was always still. I was reshelving a heavy volume on Renaissance architecture when the atmosphere shifted. It wasn't a sound. The library was full of sounds. Shuffling feet, coughing, the hum of the HVAC system. This was a change in pressure. The air suddenly felt thinner, charged, as if a storm front had moved indoors. I turned around, clutching the book to my chest like a shield. Vivian was standing at the end of the aisle. She shouldn't have been there. Visually, she was a violent contrast to the soft, muted palette of the library. The stacks were beige, gray, and dusty brown. Vivian was sharp lines and deep saturation. She wore a long wool coat, the color of a bruised plum, belted tight, and black leather gloves that looked soft enough to melt. She didn't look like a patron. She looked like an acquisition officer, coming to collect a debt. She didn't wave. She didn't whisper a polite hello. She just started walking toward me. The click of her heels on the linoleum was deliberate. Click, click, click. A metronome counting down the seconds until my sanctuary was officially breached. "You're hard to find," she said. Her voice wasn't a whisper, but it was pitched low, a resonant frequency that seemed to vibrate through the metal shelves. I checked the fiction section. You didn't seem like the type for made-up stories. I work here, I whispered, my voice sounding breathy and small. I'm everywhere. No, she corrected, stopping 3 feet away. You're hiding. There's a difference. She reached out, her gloved hand brushing the spine of a book on the shelf next to my head. She didn't look at the title. She was looking at me, her eyes tracking the rapid pulse I knew was visible in my neck. It's quiet, she observed, glancing up at the dusty fluorescent lights. Controlled. Sterile. It's peaceful, I defended, hugging the Renaissance architecture book tighter. People come here to think. Do they? She stepped closer. The distance between us shrank to the length of a standard hardcover. Or do they come here to be silent so they don't have to say what they want? She was doing it again, stripping the context away until only the raw nerve remained. She wasn't talking about the patrons. Why are you here, Vivian? I told you, she said, her gaze dropping to my hands, white-knuckled on the book. Decanting takes time. You can't just pull the cork and expect the wine to be ready. You have to expose it to the air. You have to let it breathe. I'm breathing, I said. Barely, she countered. She took another step. We were now sharing the same small pocket of air. In the narrow aisle, her presence was overwhelming. I could smell the cold air clinging to her coat, mixing with that signature sandalwood scent. It was intoxicating and terrifying. This was my domain. I was the one who shushed people. I was the one who enforced the rules. But Vivian moved through the world as if rules were merely suggestions for other, lesser people. She reached out and placed her hand over mine, right on the cover of the book I was holding. The leather of her glove was cold against my skin. Put the book down, Lucy. I need to shelf it. Put it down. I slid the book onto the nearest empty shelf. It wasn't where it belonged. It was out of order. The librarian in me screamed at the chaos, but the woman in me, the one who had been waking up since Christmas Eve, couldn't look away from Vivian's face. You've spent years building this, she said softly, gesturing to the walls of books around us. A fortress of paper. It's impressive, but it's dusty, and it's lonely. I like being alone. Liar, she said, but there was no malice in it, only a smooth, dark certainty. You like safety. You like knowing the ending before you start the chapter. But that's not living. That's just reading. She leaned in, her face inches from mine. I pressed my back against the metal shelf, the cool steel biting into my shoulder blades. I was trapped between the knowledge of the world and the experience of it. Come with me, she said. I have 2 hours left on my shift. I don't care. Her eyes were unflinching, demanding. Leave the books. The stories will still be here tomorrow. But the snow is falling now, and the light is changing, and I want to see what happens when you step out of the dust. My heart hammered against my ribs. To leave in the middle of a shift was unthinkable. It was irresponsible. It was chaotic. Okay, I whispered. The word hung in the silence, heavier than any encyclopedia. Vivian smiled, and for the first time, it reached her eyes. It was a predator's smile, satisfied and sharp. Good, she said, stepping back and opening the space between us, leaving me cold and wanting the heat back. Get your coat. We're going for a walk. The transition from the temperature-controlled, dust-scented air of the library to the biting reality of the street was a physical shock. It was a slap of cold that woke every nerve ending I had spent the day trying to numb with routine. The sky was a flat, heavy gray, the kind that promises a storm isn't just passing through, it's settling in. Snow was falling in thick, wet clumps, muting the city's usual mechanical roar into a soft, insulated hush. It was as if the world had decided to lower its voice to match ours. Vivian didn't ask where I was going. She simply turned left, her boots crunching into the fresh powder with a rhythmic, decisive sound, and I fell into step beside her. We walked in silence for a block, the only sound the friction of our coats and the distant hiss of tires on wet asphalt. It wasn't an awkward silence, though. It was a calibrated one. Vivian wasn't ignoring me. She was letting the change in environment settle, waiting for the cold to strip away the last of my librarian armor. You wear it well, she said finally, not looking at me. her gaze fixed on the gray horizon of the street.
Where what? I asked, burying my chin deeper into my scarf.
The quiet, she said. Most people fidget when they step outside. They check their phones, they look for a distraction. You just exist in it. You fold yourself into the silence like it's a second coat. It's safer, I admitted, the cold making me honest. If you're quiet, people project what they want onto you. You don't have to disappoint them with the reality until it's absolutely necessary. Vivian stopped. We were under the awning of a closed bakery, the smell of cold yeast and sugar lingering faintly in the air. She turned to face me, the snow catching in her dark hair, melting against the warmth of her skin. The street was empty, the weather having driven everyone else indoors, creating a private room in the middle of the public city. "Is that what happened with the sugar water girl?" she asked. "You let her project, and then you disappointed her?" "I let her think I was easy," I said, the admission tasting bitter. "I let her think I was a light read." Then she opened the book and realized the font was too small and the chapters were too long. "And you think that's a flaw," Vivian stated. "It's lonely," I countered. "Being a difficult read means most people put you back on the shelf." Vivian moved then, closing the small distance between us. She reached out and took my hand. She didn't ask. She just took it. Her leather glove against my wool mitten should have been clumsy, a barrier of fabrics, but it felt incredibly intimate. She squeezed, a firm, grounding pressure that traveled up my arm and settled in my chest. "Lucy," she said, her voice dropping, cutting under the wind. "Look at me." I looked. Her eyes were dark, serious, and entirely devoid of the polite dismissal I was used to. "You are terrified of being undone," she said, referencing the question she'd asked nights ago in the wine bar. "Why? What do you think happens if the binding breaks?" "I don't know how to put myself back together," I whispered. The fear was a cold stone in my stomach, heavier than the winter air. If I lose control, if I let go of the rigidness, I'm afraid I'll just be a mess of pages on the floor. I've spent 30 years learning how to be composed, how to be neat. If I unravel, I stay unraveled. Vivian squeezed my hand again, harder this time. "That's the point," she said, her intensity flaring hot enough to burn. "You don't put it back the same way. You're not a museum exhibit, Lucy. You're not supposed to be preserved in pristine condition. You break the structure so you can build something bigger, something that actually fits you." She stepped closer, her breath clouding in the space between us. "I don't want to put you back together. I want to see what you look like when you're not trying to hold the shape everyone else expects." The wind gusted, blowing snow into our faces, but I didn't pull away. I didn't want to. The heat from her hand was the only anchor I had in the swirling gray. "It's cold," she said, her thumb brushing the back of my hand through the wool. "And I have a bottle of a 2015 Nebbiolo that needs to be opened. It's tight, high acid, difficult." She smiled, a small, dangerous curve of her lips. "It reminds me of you." "Are you inviting me over to drink wine or to analyze my psyche?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. "Yes," she said. She tugged my hand, not aggressively, but with an invitation that felt inevitable. "Come on, my place is 3 blocks away. And I promise," she added, her eyes catching the reflection of a street lamp, "I won't try to fix you. I just want to taste the vintage." I looked at the library behind us, a gray block fading into the snow. Then I looked at Vivian, vibrant and terrifying and real. "Okay," I said, and we walked into the white. The key turned in the lock with a heavy, satisfying thunk, the sound of a vault ceiling rather than a door opening. Vivian pushed the door inward, and the warmth of her apartment washed over us, instantaneous and enveloping. It wasn't the stifling, overheated air of the public library, but a dry, curated warmth that smelled faintly of unscented beeswax and clean linen. I stepped across the threshold, and the door clicked shut behind me, sealing out the wind, the snow, and the safety of the gray world I knew. Her space was a physical manifestation of her personality, minimalist, intentional, and terrifyingly precise. There were no piles of mail, no stray shoes, no clutter to hide behind. The floors were dark hardwood, polished to a gleam that reflected the low, ambient light of the floor lamps. The furniture was low and modern, dressed in charcoals and creams. It was a space that demanded you be present because there was nothing else to look at. "Coats," Vivian said, her voice softer now that we were inside the insulation of her walls. I fumbled with my buttons, my fingers clumsy from the cold and the sudden spike in adrenaline. Vivian didn't help me. She knew better than to treat me like a child. But she watched. She stripped off her own heavy wool coat with a fluid, practiced motion, revealing the sharp lines of a black silk blouse underneath. When she hung our coats side by side in the closet, the fabrics brushed against each other. My sensible gray wool against her deep plum cashmere. It looked like an intimacy I hadn't earned yet. "Shoes off," she instructed, toeing off her boots. "I don't allow salt on the floors." We stood in the entryway in our stocking feet. The removal of the boots felt more significant than the coats. It changed our height difference, grounded us. Without the armor of outdoor gear, I felt smaller, softer. I was just a woman in a dress, standing in the home of a woman who looked at me like I was a rare, uncatalogued manuscript. She led me to the kitchen, which was open to the living area. She moved with a domestic efficiency that was fascinating to watch. She didn't ask what I wanted. She simply set out a slate board, a knife, a block of sharp, aged cheddar, and a loaf of crusty bread. Then, she reached for the Nebbiolo she had promised. The sound of the cork popping was loud in the quiet room. She poured 2 glasses, the liquid a translucent garnet, lighter than the heavy reds of the cellar, but deceptive in its structure. "To the difficult vintages," she murmured, sliding a glass across the marble island to me. I took a sip. It was sharp, acidic, with a grip of tannins that dried my mouth instantly, followed by a rush of floral sweetness that lingered. It was complex. It was demanding. "It fights you at first," I observed, the librarian in me analyzing the data. "Only because it expects you to give up," Vivian countered, leaning her hip against the counter, her glass held loosely in her fingers. "It tests your commitment." We ate standing up. The ritual of breaking bread and cutting cheese usually softens a mood, makes it casual. But here, the cadence was different. Every movement was weighted. The way she tore a piece of bread, the way she watched me swallow the wine, it was all deliberate. The silence between us wasn't empty. It was thickening, filling the room like water rising in a tank. I realized then that the dynamic had shifted. In the restaurant, she had been the savior. In the cellar, she had been the teacher. In the library, the intruder. But here, in the soft light of her home, the roles were dissolving. She wasn't serving me anymore. The sommelier was gone. She was waiting. I set my glass down, the sound of crystal on marble ringing out like a bell. "You're staring," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "I'm reading," she corrected. Her gaze was unflinching. It didn't dart away when I caught it. It held mine, heavy and dark. It traced the line of my throat. The pulse I knew was visible there, the tension in my shoulders. "And?" I challenged, the wine giving me a ghost of courage. "What does the text say?" Vivian set her glass down next to mine. She didn't move closer, but the air between us compressed, charged with a static that made the hair on my arms stand up. "It says you're tired of holding the spine together," she said low. "It says you're waiting for someone to take the weight so you can finally fall apart." The truth of it hit me in the center of my chest, knocking the wind out of me. I wanted to deny it. I wanted to retreat to the safety of my quiet, controlled life. But the pull was undeniable. It was gravity. "I don't know how to let go," I admitted. "I know," she said. She pushed off the counter, moving not toward me, but toward the living room, toward the low, velvet couch that looked like a shadow in the corner. She stopped and looked back, extending a hand. "That's why you're here." I looked at her hand. Then I looked at her eyes. "Come here, Lucy." I left the safety of the kitchen island. I walked across the polished floor, my steps silent, and took her hand. The velvet of the couch was cool against the backs of my legs as I sat, but everything else in the room was rapidly heating up. The distance between us, which had been a chasm in the restaurant and a buffer in the library, had now vanished completely. Vivian didn't sit next to me. She sat turned toward me, her knee pressing firmly against my thigh, a point of contact that felt like a heavy paperweight holding down a fluttering page. She didn't say the words this time. She didn't need to ask if I was ready to be undone. The question was there in the way her hand moved, slow and deliberate, rising to cup my jaw. Her thumb traced the line of my cheekbone with a pressure that was both possessive and inquiring. It was the touch of someone examining a rare binding, checking for cracks, testing the give of the material. I stopped breathing. My lungs felt paralyzed, suspended in the amber tension of the moment. I was so used to holding myself in, shoulders back, spine straight, emotions cataloged and shelved away where they couldn't cause a scene. But Vivian wasn't looking for the catalog. She was looking for the story underneath. "Breathe," she whispered, her thumb brushing over the pulse that was hammering frantically in my neck. I let the air out in a shuddering exhale, and with it, the first brick of my fortress crumbled. She leaned in, and the scent of her, that dark, grounding mix of sandalwood, rain, and the faint tannic bite of the Nebbiolo flooded my senses. It was overwhelming. It drowned out the dust of the library and the cold of the snow. When she kissed me, it wasn't tentative. There was no hesitation, no polite testing of the waters. It was an assertion. Her mouth was soft but demanding, moving against mine with a rhythm that cut straight through the noise in my head. It was a silencer. The constant, anxious monologue that ran through my mind. Am I doing this right? Is this okay? Is this too much? Was suddenly quieted, replaced by the singular, roaring focus of her lips on mine. I made a sound, a low, broken noise that I would have been mortified to make in public, but here, in the shadows of her apartment, it sounded like an admission. My hands, which had been gripping the edge of the cushion, found the courage to move. I reached up, my fingers tangling in the silk of her blouse, pulling her closer. This was the undoing. It wasn't a violent destruction. It was a systematic dismantling of every defense I had spent 32 years perfecting. As her hands moved, sliding from my jaw to my neck, then down to the small of my back, I felt the rigid structure of my posture collapse. I wasn't holding myself up anymore. She was holding me. I felt the heat of her skin searing through the fabric of my dress. The friction of her body against mine created a static charge that made my nerves sing. It was terrifying. It was the loss of control I had feared since I was a child, the messiness of raw emotions spilling out without a container to catch it. I was unraveling, the threads of my carefully woven composure snapping one by one. "Vivian," I gasped, breaking the kiss because I needed to verify that this was real, that I wasn't just hallucinating a savior in the snow. "I'm here," she murmured against my skin, her voice a low rumble that vibrated in my chest. "I've got you. Let go, Lucy. Let go." The command bypassed my brain and went straight to my muscles. I slumped against her, my head falling back, exposing my throat. It was a gesture of total submission, a surrender of the protected self. I felt her hands in my hair, pulling the pins that held my bun in its severe professional twist. The hair fell heavy around my shoulders, a curtain closing out the rest of the world. I felt messy. I felt chaotic. I felt exposed in a way that had nothing to do with clothes and everything to do with being known. She kissed the sensitive skin below my ear, and a shockwave of sensation rolled through me, so intense my vision blurred. I was crying. I didn't even realize it until I felt the hot track of tears on my cheeks. They weren't tears of sadness. They were the physical manifestation of a pressure valve finally being released. The intensity I had been suppressing, the too much that Sarah had rejected, was pouring out of me, and Vivian wasn't backing away. She wasn't disgusted. She kissed the tears away, tasting the salt, unflinching. "See?" she whispered, her forehead resting against mine, our breaths mingling in short, ragged gasps. "You're not broken. You're just open." "It's too much," I choked out, my hands gripping her shoulders now, anchoring myself to her solidity. "It's exactly enough," she countered. Her hands tightened on my waist, grounding me. I'm not going anywhere. You can fall apart. I'll stay right here until the pieces settle. And for the first time in my life, I believed it. I let the storm take me, secure in the knowledge that the woman holding me knew exactly how to weather the wind. The librarian was gone, dissolved in the heat of the moment. There was only Lucy, undone and terrifyingly, wonderfully free. The light that filtered through the heavy curtains wasn't the harsh, interrogating glare I was used to waking up to in my own apartment. It was a soft, diffuse gray, the color of a winter sky that has exhausted its snow. It painted the room in muted tones of charcoal and slate, turning the sharp, minimalist lines of Vivian's bedroom into something softer, hazier. I lay still for a long time, afraid that movement might shatter the fragile reality of the morning. Usually, waking up in a strange space brought a spike of anxiety, the immediate, frantic cataloging of where I was, what time it was, and how quickly I could retreat to my own territory. But the panic didn't come. Instead, there was a heavy, languid calm that weighed down my limbs, a sensation like being submerged in warm water. I turned my head on the pillow, the fabric cool and smelling faintly of lavender detergent. Vivian was asleep beside me. Seeing the sommelier asleep felt like breaking a rule, or perhaps like being granted a security clearance level I hadn't applied for. In the restaurant, and even in the cellar, she had been a creature of vertical lines and sharp angles, poised, alert, always 2 steps ahead of the conversation. Asleep, the tension had drained out of her. Her dark hair was a chaotic spill across the white pillowcase, stripping away the severity of her usual style. Her mouth, usually set in that knowing, slightly challenging curve, was soft, slightly parted. One hand was curled near her face, the fingers relaxed, no longer gripping a wine stem or a steering wheel. She looked human. She looked approachable. I shifted slightly, propping myself up on one elbow to observe her. The movement pulled the sheet down, exposing my own shoulder, and I looked at my skin in the gray light. I felt different. I checked myself internally for damage, for the mess I had been so terrified of becoming. I had been undone, yes. I had been unraveled. But I didn't feel broken. I felt expanded. The metaphor of the book came back to me, but revised. I wasn't a book that had been torn apart. I was a book that had finally been cracked open properly. The spine flexed so the pages could lie flat, allowing the story to actually be read. The tightness in my chest, the constant low-level hum of holding myself together, was gone. It was a restructuring, not a demolition. Careful not to wake her, I slipped out of bed. The floorboards were cold under my bare feet, a grounding reminder that the world outside this room still existed. I found one of her shirts draped over a chair, a crisp white button-down that smelled of her perfume, and pulled it on. It was too big, the cuffs swallowing my hands, but wrapping myself in her clothes felt like a second layer of intimacy, a physical claim. I wandered into the kitchen. The silence here was different from the library. The library's silence was heavy with the weight of thousands of words waiting to be read. This silence was companionable. It was the silence of a pause, not a stop. I found the coffee beans in a glass jar and a grinder on the counter. The domestic ritual of making coffee, measuring the beans, the loud whir of the grinder, the drip of the water, felt incredibly grounding. I found bread in the pantry and dropped 2 slices into the toaster. I was staring out the window at the snow-covered street, lost in the memory of her hands on my waist, when the smell of burning carbon snapped me back. I gasped, fumbling with the toaster, popping the lever. The toast was charred black in the center, a culinary disaster. In my old life, this would have been a crisis, a sign of incompetence, a reason to apologize. I like it dark, a voice rasped from the doorway. I spun around. Vivian was leaning against the doorframe, wrapped in a silk robe, her eyes sleepy, but smiling. She walked over, took the burnt toast from my hand, and took a bite without hesitation. The crunch was loud in the quiet kitchen. "Good morning," she mumbled, chewing. "I burned it. I said, waiting for the critique. You added texture, she corrected, reaching for the coffee I had poured. She took a sip, then looked at me over the rim of the mug. Her gaze wasn't the intense laser of the night before. It was warm, affectionate. You're still here. I'm still here, I confirmed, the words feeling solid and true. Vivian set the mug down and stepped into my space, wrapping her arms around my waist, pulling me into the silk of her robe. Good, she whispered into my hair, because I haven't even started on the white wines yet. I laughed, a genuine, unpracticed sound that filled the kitchen. The rejection at the wine bar felt a lifetime ago. I wasn't the quiet librarian anymore. I was the complex vintage, and I had finally found someone with the palate to appreciate me. The heavy brass bell above the door chimed, marking the arrival of another group of revelers shaking off the December chill. It was New Year's Eve, and the vintage was operating at absolute capacity. The air was thick with the scent of expensive champagne, heavy perfume, and the electric hum of anticipation that always precedes the turning of a calendar page. I sat at table 4, the same table where, exactly 1 week ago, I had been a tragic figure in green velvet, staring at an empty chair. The green dress was back in my closet, replaced by a deep midnight blue silk that felt like water against my skin. And the chair across from me was not empty. Vivian was currently navigating the crowded room, moving through the chaotic sea of bodies with the same sharp, cutting grace she'd shown the night we met. She held 2 glasses high above the fray, her eyes locked on mine as she approached. She didn't smile. Vivian rarely gave away her expressions for free to the public, but there was a softness around her eyes that belonged entirely to me. She slipped into the seat, the movement fluid, reclaiming the space. She set the glasses down. Sparkling wine this time, but not the cheap, sugary stuff they were passing out at the bar. This was golden, with a fine, persistent bead rising from the bottom of the flute. Grower champagne, she said, her voice cutting under the roar of the room, pitched perfectly for my ears alone. Small production, high tension, incredible depth. I picked up the glass, admiring the way the bubbles raced to the surface. Another metaphor? I asked, arching a brow. Always, she replied, clinking her glass against mine. The sound was a clear, sharp note of triumph. To the complex vintages, and the patience required to enjoy them. We drank. The wine was crisp, bracing, waking up my palate. I looked over the rim of my glass at the front door. I half expected to see the ghost of my former self sitting there, rigid, terrified, holding her breath to keep from taking up too much space. I thought about Sarah, the woman who had walked out. I realized now that her departure hadn't been an act of cruelty, but an act of calibration. The universe had been correcting a mistake. If she had stayed, if she had been polite enough to endure a dinner with the quiet librarian, I never would have met the woman who saw the quiet as a canvas rather than a void. I wasn't rejected. I was saved. I was pruned back so I could grow in the right direction. Under the table, Vivian's hand found my knee. Her touch was firm, possessive, the warmth of her palm seeping through the silk of my dress. It was a secret conversation happening below the surface of the polite society around us. Above the table, we were 2 women enjoying a drink. Below, we were a tangled knot of shared history and electric current. You're thinking loudly again, Vivian observed, her thumb tracing a slow circle on my inner thigh. I'm thinking that I like this version of the story better, I said, leaning in. The noise of the party faded into a dull roar, significant only because it highlighted our private silence. I like the chapter where the librarian gets the girl. The librarian didn't just get the girl, Vivian corrected, her eyes dark and unflinching. She earned her. You have to be willing to be read, to be understood, Lucy. I'm ready, I whispered, the truth of it settling in my bones. Read me. The countdown began on the televisions mounted in the corners of the room. 10, 9. The crowd swelled, a collective intake of breath. 8, 7. I didn't look at the screen. I looked at Vivian. I looked at the sharp line of her jaw, the way her dark hair fell against her neck, the absolute certainty in her posture. I wasn't afraid of the intensity anymore. I wasn't afraid of being too much. I realized that for the right person, I would never be too much. I would just be enough.
3, 2, 1. The room erupted in cheers. Confetti cannons fired somewhere near the bar. But in the quiet eye of the storm at table 4, Vivian leaned across the small distance. She didn't kiss me with the desperate heat of the apartment. She kissed me slow, deep, and deliberate. A seal on a contract. A promise of more undoing to come. The door of the wine bar opened, letting in a blast of winter air that swirled around our ankles. But I didn't shiver. I was anchored by the heat of her hand on my thigh and the taste of gold on my tongue. We were solid. If you've ever found strength in letting go, subscribe to hear more stories about the art of being found.